Good evening, I'm David Kramer with Alaska Weather. As always, please call our weather info line with the updated number 1-885-937-4977. Get any updates to the forecast or check out any watches, warnings, or advisories that we might have out for your area. You can also check out our website, weather.gov/Alaska, to get any updates through that means as well. Starting off, we'll take a look at the watch and advisory that we do have out for the state. This is all flooding related with the high amounts of rainfall that we've seen out over the interior combined with some areas of snow melt. We do have flooding concerns for the central interior. There's a flood watch out for central interior from Thursday morning through Saturday evening. And then we also have a flood advisory out that's around much of the Tanana River, and that is going to be active until 3:15 p.m. on Sunday. Elsewhere in the interior, we do have high river levels, especially in those south and eastern locations. Taking a look at our fire, we do have fire activity starting to moderate now that we are starting to see some cooler and damper weather, and that should be coming up as well too with more cool and damp weather on the way. However, even though things are starting to be cool, they're not necessarily dry out in the western interior. We are still seeing some drought-stricken fuels, so fire activity could still be very active even though we do have some rain on the way and some cooler temps. So anywhere that you're looking to do any burns, please check for burn restrictions, even though we are starting to see, again, some of the cooler and damper conditions. Not necessarily done with fire weather yet. And next week, we are looking at some wetter weather continuing, and there's going to be plenty of rain. So even with that, the large fires could still reemerge. We'll need quite a bit of rain to start to really taper some of those down. Taking a look at the fire danger for tomorrow, we do look at high or very high in some of the central interior, but especially out as we get to western interior and the Seward Peninsula areas. Taking a look at our satellite imagery, starting up north, we can see that upper level system moving through that's bringing in a lot of colder air and some areas of snow to the far northeastern portions of the mainland. So you watch this again, we'll track our low by the Gulf of Alaska. That's bringing some rain to areas of the Gulf and extending front out by the southern portions of the Panhandle. Out by the western Aleutian Islands farther to the south, we're seeing some cloud cover and rain moving closer towards the islands. And then finally out over the southern portions of the mainland, we are seeing some rain tracking through much of South Central as well. So as we look at our weather for the remainder of the day, starting off in South Central, we do have those showers throughout the area, extending out to Southwest Alaska as well. Up in the interior, we have areas of smoke throughout much of the area with some showers as we get farther to the east. And then up in the northeastern portion of the state, including the Brooks Range and Arctic coastline, we are seeing some areas of snow coming in. I could see up to an inch of new snowfall in some of those locations. Then along much of the northwest coast down to the Bering Strait area, expecting to see some areas of fog. Down in the Gulf of Alaska, system coming in that's bringing some rain to areas of the Panhandle. And then as we look out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, we are seeing ridging out over much of the area, keeping some areas fairly dry right now. But if we look out west, we can see some rain heading in from the south. As we move into tonight, another system will follow the first one, bringing rain to the central and western Aleutian Islands, with our ridging starting to track farther to the east. Out over southwest Alaska, we're going to see some areas of rain extending out over south central as well. And then as we move up into the interior, areas of smoke are going to dominate the area. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see that snow continuing for much of the northeastern locations. And then for western locations of the North Slope, we are going to see some areas of fog extending down through the Bering Strait area, including Kotzebue Sound. Down in the Panhandle, we're going to see continued rain from that low out over the eastern portions of the Gulf of Alaska. As we move into Thursday with that low diminishing but staying in similar area, we're going to see continued rain, especially in the southern locations of the Panhandle. More rain is on the way for south central Alaska, extending down through southwest Alaska and the Alaska Peninsula. As we move into the interior, expecting to see a lot of smoke remain in the area on Thursday. Up along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see some areas of fog extending throughout much of the Arctic coast and down through Kotzebue Sound area and Bering Strait area. Then our system out by the western Aleutians is pushed farther to the north, extending rain throughout the Aleutian Islands and then into some of the areas of the southern Bering Sea. On Friday, that system will push into the Bering Sea, bringing rain throughout much of the southern Bering, Aleutian Islands, and Alaska Peninsula. We're going to see more rain out by southwest Alaska, extending into south central and up into areas of the interior now on Friday. Some lingering areas of smoke may be around the Yukon Flats area, but we will see rain extending up farther north into the Brooks Range. Along the Arctic coastline, expecting to see fog all along the Arctic coast, down through Kotzebue Sound and the Bering Strait. Finally, down in the Panhandle, we do expect to see rain from our low to the south of the area. For our low temperatures starting Thursday morning, we are going to see in the lower 50s to right around 50 for the Panhandle, as well as much of south central Alaska. Thursday afternoon highs in the Panhandle getting up to around 60 and lower 60s for south central. Friday morning dropping down to near 50 again for the Panhandle and the lower 50s for south central Alaska. And then highs in the lower 60s for the Panhandle and around 60 degrees for south central. Up in the interior, getting up to around 50 degrees, or getting down to 50 degrees rather, for Thursday morning, and then in the 30s for the Arctic coastline. Thursday afternoon highs getting up to around 70 degrees for some of the western locations of the interior, and then up into the 40s along the Arctic coast. Friday morning lows dropping down into the 50s for the interior, into the 40s for the west coast, and into the 30s along the Arctic coast. And then Friday afternoon highs getting into the 60s for the interior, especially those eastern locations, near 50 for some of the areas around Kotzebue Sound, and then in the 40s for some of the areas around the Arctic coast. Southwest Alaska going to get down into the lower 50s for the areas, for especially the interior locations, getting down into the 40s for the Aleutians. Thursday afternoon highs getting up into the 50s for much of Southwest and into the 50s for the Aleutians as well. Friday morning lows dropping down to around 50 degrees for Southwest and into the 40s for the Aleutians. Then finally, Friday afternoon, we're going to get back up into the 50s for much of Southwest, staying in the mid-50s for much of the Aleutians as well. Climate outlook, we're looking at colder temperatures throughout all of the state for the 6 to 10.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
For aviation, we'll start off with a quick look at our flying weather starting on Thursday morning. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands, widespread IFR conditions are expected that are going to make their way towards the coastline of southwest Alaska. Elsewhere in southwest, we're expecting to see MVFR conditions that extend out over south central Alaska and Kodiak Island. Some isolated areas of IFR are also expected for south central. Down in the Panhandle, expecting widespread MVFR conditions with IFR conditions farther to the south. Up along the Arctic coastline, more areas of IFR conditions are expected. As we move into Thursday afternoon, continuing to see IFR conditions along much of the Arctic coastline, VFR conditions for much of the interior, and then MVFR conditions for southwest Alaska and much of south central Alaska. Out over the Bering Sea and Aleutians, IFR conditions are expected, and once again, those IFR conditions are starting to make it to the coastline of southwest Alaska. Then down in the Panhandle, VFR conditions expected up north, gradually diminishing to become IFR as we get farther to the south. Then on Friday morning, widespread MVFR conditions for the Panhandle, Gulf, and much of southern south central Alaska. And then down in the south of the Panhandle, we're also going to see some isolated areas of IFR. Up in mainland Alaska, southwest, we'll see MVFR conditions becoming IFR as we get to the coastline, and those IFR conditions are going to spread out through much of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. Then up along the Arctic coastline, starting to push some of the IFR conditions farther to the north, leaving some MVFR conditions near the coastline. Friday afternoon, going to see some MVFR and IFR up by the northwest coast of the Arctic coastline, or VFR conditions as we move farther to the east. MVFR conditions are going to start to spread into the interior Friday afternoon and extend down to southwest Alaska and south central. Also down in southwest and south central, we'll see some areas of IFR, and those areas of IFR will extend out to much of the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands. And then finally, for the Panhandle area, we are going to see widespread MVFR conditions extending into the Gulf of Alaska, and that does include Yakutat as well. For our passes, starting up north, AKwx, we'll be starting off IFR and then improving to VFR in the afternoon. Adigan Pass will also start off IFR and then improve all the way to VFR. Lake Clark and Merrill should both stay MVFR all day on Thursday. Rainy should start off MVFR and then improve to VFR conditions. Windy would also start off MVFR, improving to VFR, as will Isabel Pass and Mentasta Pass. For Tanita, going to start off all the way down to IFR and then improve to VFR in the afternoon. And Portage will start off IFR, improving to marginal conditions later in the day. Chilkoot and White both starting off MVFR and then improving all the way to VFR. For our freezing levels, we're going to see some cold air up along the Arctic coastline, giving way to some potential for some snow up there by the Brooks Range, but getting warm as we move farther to the south, with some of the warmest areas out over the Bering Sea and central Aleutian Islands, with freezing levels up to 14,000 feet, and then getting colder again as we move farther to the west. Out over the Panhandle, a little area of colder air dropping down to around 8,000 feet for those freezing levels. As we look at our areas of icing, we're going to see the main area that's going to impact mainland Alaska is going to be up over the northeastern portion of the state, between 2,000 and 7,000 feet, and then a smaller area south of the Panhandle above 7,000 feet. For our jet stream, strongest portion of the jet is actually going to be out by the western Aleutian Islands with southwesterly winds up to as high as 100 knots, but as it moves over the island, it's going to be more around 65 knots. A jet streak out over the west coast around 70 knots, going to increase to 80 knots exiting out over the Alaska Peninsula. And then up by the northeastern portions of the state, northwesterly wind 65 knots, and then 80 knots out of the south as we drop down by the Panhandle. For 9,000 feet, we're going to see some stronger winds by the Panhandle up to 55 knots to the east of the area, but as we get over the Panhandle itself in the southern locations, we are going to see 35 knots out of that more southerly direction. Up in the northeastern portions of mainland Alaska, we're going to see some stronger winds out of a northerly direction, getting up to as high as about 25 knots. And then just off the coastline of southwest Alaska, 35 knots out of a northwesterly direction, dropping to 30 knots over the peninsula. And then as we look out over the Aleutian Islands, southerly winds up to as high as 45 knots just to the south of the islands, but dropping down closer towards 35 knots as we get to the central Aleutians. And then down to 3,000 feet, we're going to see some of the stronger winds once again by the Panhandle area, 40 knots over southern locations of the Panhandle out of a southeasterly direction, 35 knots up in the far northeastern places of mainland Alaska out of a northwesterly direction, 35 knots out over the Bristol Bay area out of a northwesterly direction, and then up to as high as 40 knots out over the central Aleutian Islands out of the south. Finally, as we look at turbulence, we saw those stronger winds in the southern portions of the Panhandle. That's going to bring us some moderate turbulence for the area as well. We're expecting that in the southern locations to be below 5,000 feet.
Some places on the surface, you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places, you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds, that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
Why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, Alex uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Welcome back for the marine section of the forecast. We'll start off with a quick look at the ice edge. Big thing to note is that we are seeing melting continuing for the middle of the ice pack, as well as areas along the coastline and along the ice edge itself. Down in southeast Alaska on Thursday, we're looking at some weaker winds in the central and northern portions of the interior or the inside waters, but down in the southern locations we are seeing stronger winds, 30 knots out of a southeasterly direction. Eastern portions of the Gulf are seeing easterly winds, 20 to 25 knots, dropping down to 10 knots out of the west up in the northern Gulf. Then on Friday, southerly winds in the inside waters, 10 to 15 knots, and weak winds out over the Gulf, only 10 to 15 knots. For south central Alaska on Thursday, weak winds around 10 knots out over the Gulf waters and Prince William Sound, southerly winds in Cook Inlet, 10 to 20 knots. Then on Friday, still seeing fairly weak winds in the Gulf waters, 10 to 15 knots there. East 15 in Prince William Sound. Strongest winds are in Cook Inlet area, southerly winds 20 to 25 knots. And then southwest winds 15 knots west of the Barren Islands. For Thursday, we're seeing primarily westerly winds around the Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island, around 20 knots, a little bit weaker by Sandpoint, only around 15 knots there. Then on Friday, south to southwest winds throughout all of these locations, 15 to 20 knots, strongest on the Pacific side. For the Aleutian Islands, eastern Aleutians, west winds 15 to 20 knots, and then becoming east winds 20 to 25 knots for the central and western Aleutians. Then on Friday, we're seeing southerly winds for the central and eastern Aleutians, 15 to 20 knots, and out by the western Aleutians, westerly flow 15 to 20 knots expected. Along the west coast of the state, southern locations seeing westerly winds 15 to 25 knots, strongest by the Pribilof Islands. As we get up by St. Lawrence Island, northerly winds 20 knots, and then weak winds around 5 knots for the Norton Sound area. Then on Friday, primarily seeing northerly winds 15 knots in Norton Sound, 25 by St. Lawrence Island, 15 to 20 as we get a little bit farther to the south, and then south of Nunavik Island, switching it up, becoming southwesterly 15 knots, and then by the Pribilof Islands, easterly winds 15 knots. Along the Arctic coast, we're going to see westerly winds 15 to 20 knots in eastern locations, and then down the west coast from Utqiagvik west, we are going to see winds picking up as we move farther to the south, 10 to 15 knots up north, and then 20 knots by the Bering Strait. On Friday, light winds along the Arctic coastline, westerly around 10 knots, getting up to 15 as we get west of Wainwright, and then down the rest of the west coast, 15 to 25 knots out of the north, strongest around the Bering Strait area. For our weather for tonight, we are going to see some smoke lingering in the interior, but that's not all. We do have, with all of the recent rainfall and some of the snowmelt as well, we do have some flood products out with a lot of the rivers in the central, southern, and eastern interior all seeing high levels. We do have a flood watch out for the central interior starting Thursday morning going through Saturday evening, and then a flood advisory along the Tanana River. It's going to be out until 3:15 p.m. on Sunday. For weather elsewhere, we are going to see some snow coming in the eastern portions of the Arctic coast as well as the eastern Brooks Range. And then we're going to see some fog areas farther to the west extending down to the Kotzebue Sound area as well as down through the Bering Strait. Southern portions of mainland Alaska, including south central and southwest Alaska, are going to see rain, and that rain is going to extend down into the Alaska Peninsula as well. To the west of the area, we have some ridging that's keeping the eastern Aleutian Islands as well as the Pribilof Islands in fairer weather conditions, but we do have a system approaching from the south towards the central and western Aleutian Islands that's going to bring some rain to the area. Then out farther to the east in the Gulf of Alaska area, we have low pressure moving towards the eastern Gulf. That's going to bring rainfall to the Panhandle area with the heaviest rainfall in the southern locations. Then as we move into Thursday, going to see more rain for the Panhandle again. Heaviest rain is going to be in the south. And then for mainland Alaska, we're going to see rain throughout south central Alaska, southwest Alaska, and down into the Alaska Peninsula. In the interior, you're expecting to see some areas of smoke lingering throughout the day on Thursday. And then along the Arctic coastline, we're going to see areas of fog extending along much of the Arctic coast, down through Kotzebue Sound and the Bering Strait. As we move into the Aleutians and Bering, we have the system coming up from the south, approaching the central Aleutians. That's going to bring rainfall to all the Aleutian Islands, but ridging will keep some of the areas of the Pribilof still fairly clear for Thursday. As we move into Friday, that system will push into the southern portions of the Bering Sea, extending rain throughout the Aleutian Islands, the southern Bering, and out through the Alaska Peninsula. We'll also have rainfall for southwest Alaska, south central Alaska, and finally extending up throughout much of the interior, with some lingering areas of smoke for the far eastern interior. Some rain will be in the Bering Sea as well, or the Brooks Range rather, and then we'll see some areas of fog along the Arctic coastline down through the Bering Strait, and more rainfall for the Panhandle. With Alaska Weather, I'm David Kramer.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.